I did have some things to say in preparation, but one thing that we have to understand before we can even begin this discussion is the concept of the burden of proof. I did have some things to say, like I mentioned, but I think I'd rather just tackle some of the misrepresentations that I think we've just seen of the position of atheism. The first is a rather important case, which is, do we actually have anything to prove as non-believers in God? Atheism, as Abdullah quite rightly suggests, is thought of by many as simply a lack of belief in God. And the point was raised that no, that can't be the case, because a lack of belief in God entails some belief in the opposite, or at least a belief in a universe that can be explained without God. This isn't the case. Atheism is a claim to belief. It comes from the Greek, a meaning without, theos meaning God. It simply means living your life without the influence of a God. It's not an active position to hold. Many people would call it agnosticism, because we're simply saying, well, there's no good reason to believe in a God, but we're not saying that we believe there isn't one. But agnosticism is a claim to knowledge. Gnosticism is knowledge. Theism is belief. I simply say, I don't know, therefore I don't believe. Whereas the proposition seem to have to say that they also don't know, because nobody can know for certain, and yet they do believe. And what we need to see tonight, in order to agree with the proposition and have them win the debate, is the reason why they're able to take that extra step that we simply can't. So let me explain with an analogy that comes from a friend of mine called Matt Dillahunty, who has given the example of a gumball, a jar of gumballs. What's essentially happening here is we've got a jar of gumballs, and we have no idea how many gumballs are in the jar. And the people to my right are pointing it and saying there are an even number of gumballs in that jar. And I say, you have no good reason to believe that. I don't believe you. And they say, oh, so that entails that you think there's an odd number. Well, of course it doesn't. It just means I don't believe that there's an even number. Just because I don't believe that there's a God doesn't mean I do believe that there's not one. And that's an important point to make clear, because it demonstrates the fact that the burden of proof lies with the proposition. If you, ladies and gentlemen, are not convinced by either side in the debate this evening, then the default position has to be atheism. The default position has to be there's no good reason to believe either way, and so we simply don't believe in Islam. That's why the title of the debate is something of a false dichotomy. But the burden of proof certainly lies with the proposition.
Just to kind of reframe this discussion in terms of what I mean by atheism, or why I mentioned the term atheism. You're right, atheism isn't a belief, but I posited that it carries a necessary corollary, something attached to it, which is, if you don't believe in God's existence, not that you may be just, it's just your default. No, if you don't believe in God's existence, that means that your worldview does not require you to posit God to explain things. And I really posited that reality imposes certain problems if you want to keep God out of that discussion, because ultimately you can't explain cause, matter, specificity, or limited and finite things.